Welcome everyone. This is a TELedvisors webinar, monthly webinar, which is usually at midday, but today it's in the afternoon. So hopefully people didn't get too confused about that. I saw at least one person get a little bit confused earlier on. So I'm very excited to announce that this will be a bit of a discussion around a recent report that's called Future Disruptions for Australian Universities. It's a report that relates to the University Accord report. And we've got with us Cherie Diaz from Western Sydney University. Welcome, Cherie.
Thank you.
Associate Professor Jason Lodge, who's in his car nearby Gatton somewhere. Professor Alex Steele from University of New South Wales, and Ruth Jelley from the NTEU, who Terry McDonald is an apology. Before we start, I will acknowledge that I'm on unceded lands of the Turrbal and Yagara people in Meanjin, Brisbane. I will give you a little bit of a brief overview of the speakers, and then I'll hand it over to Jason to talk a little bit, to give a little bit of context about this report. So Cherie Diaz is Executive Director, Education Innovation at Western Sydney University. She was previously Managing Director, Australia at Open Learning, and she helped grow that platform into a lifelong learning space, motivating and empowering more than 3 million learners across 165 countries. Is what I read, so that's pretty impressive. Welcome, Cherie. Jason Lodge is Associate Professor of Education Psychology and Director of the Learning, Instruction and Technology Lab in the School of Education at the University of Queensland. He serves as an expert advisor to the OECD and Australian National Task Force on Artificial Intelligence in Education. So he knows what he's talking about in this context. And he's also a chef. He used to be a chef. So if you want to talk to him about food, he's very good at talking about food as well. Professor Alex Steele is the Director of AI Strategy Education and a professor in the Faculty of Law and Justice at UNSW. And he is responsible for coordinating UNSW's response to generative AI. And finally, so welcome, Alex. And finally, Ruth Jelley is the NTEU Victorian Assistant Secretary and a part-time learning designer with over 20 years of experience across education, academic, and public safety sectors. So welcome, Ruth. So she will give a little bit of a perspective on what some of this might mean from an employment perspective for TELedvisors, third space workers. Okay, so that's enough of me talking. I'll hand it over to Jason in the first instance to talk a little bit about, to give a little bit of background about this report we are discussing today. Thanks, Jason.
Thanks, Hank. Hi, everybody. I'm coming to you from Yagara country, just outside of Gatton. I'm parked next to the Warrego Highway. The idea was that I would get to Gatton by the time this came around, but for reasons outside of my control, I didn't make it. So thankfully, the mobile signal here seems to be pretty good and everything's coming through clearly. Modern technology, huh? So the background to this report, it was obviously part of the Accord process. A few of us were invited to a roundtable session, which was about August, September last year. There were a wide range of people involved in that roundtable discussion, including people from the National Security College, industry groups. Simon Barry, who was the Deputy Vice Chancellor at Western Sydney University, was also there. It was a kind of weird mix, and the brief that we were given was to be provocative in that session. Anybody who knows me will know I don't need to be told that twice. So it was a very kind of frank and open discussion. The Accord panel were there. Mary O'Kane and the Accord panel were there, which I didn't realise in advance, and kind of had a moment of sheer terror when I went into this meeting. It was a Teams meeting, and the whole panel was there. I thought, oh, maybe I should hold back a bit. I didn't. So the discussion was really about what are the kinds of disruptive factors that we need to take into consideration over the sort of a short time frame, medium time frame, and then over a kind of longer time frame, which is obviously much more difficult to think about. It's crystal ball gazing stuff. As a result of that discussion, Ryan Young, who's part of the Futures Hub in the National Security College, was the one who put the report together, and credit goes to him for the way in which that report came through. I had seen the report at the end of last year, but we weren't told whether or not it was going to be released publicly, and obviously that happened a few weeks ago. If you haven't seen the report, it's worth having a read. I think Ryan did a great job of pulling together some of the key themes in that discussion and went beyond to try and capture some of the kind of zeitgeist about where we find ourselves and where we might be headed into the future. There are a few key messages that I think, for me, sort of stand out. One is just the level of uncertainty that we're dealing with now and into the future, which is probably no surprise to anybody here, given how AI is evolving, but also other technologies alongside AI. So it's not just AI that I think is interesting in this mix. How we're more globalized in higher education and what that might mean for us, whether our competitors will continue to be people who are across the other side of the city, or whether they're going to start becoming Harvard and Oxford and Cambridge and MIT in a very serious way. So there are some key ideas there, others around the way in which we use the expertise and research that we do within our own institutions to inform what we do. That's a bit of a mixed bag, I think is fair to say. But yeah, I think some kind of interesting ideas that are worth looking at. So that's where the report came from. There wasn't a lot of it that I think is fair to say that was featured in the final report of the Accord itself. But it was good to see that this actual underlying report was released publicly. So that's probably enough, I think, in terms of the background and where this came from, but some interesting ideas there that are probably worth talking more about. Thanks, Hank.
Thanks. Thanks, Jason. Okay. We'll start moving on to the first question, and I've asked the participants to. I've sent these questions to the participants in advance, so they've had a chance to look at this. I'll start with Cherie. Can you? What do you think are the main disruptive forces for higher education in the short, medium, and longer term? And how do you think individual universities or the tertiary sector overall should respond to those forces?
Thanks. I'm glad you started me off with a really easy question to answer. I think the report, if you haven't had a chance to read, I agree with Jason, it's definitely worth a read. In terms of the forces, the main ones, I think the challenge at the moment is there's lots of them, and it does depend on which part of the university or which part of the life cycle of supporting students and staff you're in. But if I talk to a couple that stand out for me, one is the evolving nature of what education and learning and teaching means across the programs that a university offers, I think is definitely one of those disruptive forms. We went from a period in COVID where, there was a quick shift for many in terms of our delivery models, etc. We're now back into, I like how we pretend that COVID's over, but more of a return to a traditional or a hybrid education model. But at the same time, the expectations, the needs of learners and students and the delivery model that they're looking for is changing, as well as the types of education. And just in a period where we've gone from, short courses or alternative credentials to micro-credentials, now we're also starting to see a move towards lifelong learning. And what does that mean and look like as well? And I think one of the challenges for us, or a disruption, is that we end up spending more time talking about how do we define that versus actually tackling what's needed to deliver it. AI is definitely a disruptive force in all of those factors, short, medium, and long term. Short term in terms of how do we respond to using and embedding this in the way we teach and support learners? What does that mean for longer term research and understanding of how that shifts or changes everything from enrollment, attracting, recruiting, right through to measuring effective teaching and learning and outcomes as well. The other lens I think that comes with that is the comfort and acceptance of skills in higher education. There's been a lot of talk as to, where do skills sit? And traditionally we've said they sit in vocational education and training, but skills actually are across the entire learning ecosystem. So what does that mean, and how do we engage in that dialogue, and how do we make sure that we're able to reflect in evidence that the teaching and learning we're delivering is producing that? I'm going to stop there because I'm sure that others have got plenty to contribute, but in terms of how do I think individual universities, and I love that you've got the tertiary sector overall included there, should respond to those forces. I think there's a couple of pieces to that, answering that question. One is curiosity and dialogue and collaboration across the sector. I think there needs to be a balance between action and considered and structured thought and planning. So what are those immediate quick wins or responses that we need to, as well as what does that mean for our longer term or overall way we exist as an organisation and a sector as well? And I might pause there. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Cherie. I'll pass it over to Alex.
Thanks. Yeah, I think Cherie sort of covered a lot of those aspects, and it's exactly completely agreed. There are probably more challenges, more disruptors than we've seen in our lifetime. I don't think we could presume to say that this is the most ever, because I'm not quite sure what it was like in the Middle Ages, but there's certainly more than we've sort of come used to having, and universities don't move fast, and there are lots of really good reasons why universities don't move fast. They're in a sense, they're medieval institutions. They're designed to last longer than one lifetime. So that sort of time scale means that they're particularly badly placed for really fast moving change. But yet at the same time, society looks to universities for guidance with fast moving change. So that's the tension that we've always got. And sort of, it's this issue of being able to have our graduates ready for their first job the first day they start, but also at the same time training them for the next job after that and the job after that, and a lifelong skill set. So how do we manage immediate needs and long-term needs in a situation where we've got an institution that is built around a lot of really quite rigid understandings of job roles? And there's good reasons for that, because they're there to protect particular aspects of what makes universities different to organisations. But we're in a climate where nobody sees universities as anything special anymore. And to argue that a university is special is inviting criticism. So there's this need for adaptation and change, but whether that's in the DNA of large universities is an interesting question. Smaller universities, younger universities, I think are more used to that. But as a sector, the sector tends to get dragged down by its bigger, older institutions. It's not as if we send the younger institutions out to sort of make us all look good. So I think there's this massive tension across the university about who we are, what our role is, and I think the answer then about what should individual universities do is that probably in lots of ways the most destructive thing we can do is to keep trying to solve all the problems ourselves on our own. We've really got to find ways to be able to come together as a sector and say there are core needs, that it's not a competitive advantage issue here. This is about doing good for society. How can we as a group put this together? And that means I think getting lots of people in universities, getting management in universities used to the concept that people that they're employing are actually working with other universities primarily rather than their own institution in order to make everything better for everyone. And I think that cultural shift is the really significant thing that underlies a lot of the challenges. Because if we fix the cultural shift, the cultural issues, then I think a lot of these sort of other issues are easier to deal with.
Thanks, Alex. That's really interesting. I'll pass it to Ruth to respond to that in the first instance.
Perfect, thank you.
Yeah, so what are your thoughts on the cultural?
On the cultural shift, look, in terms of the main disruptive forces in higher education, we've been going through one of, I think, the most significant disruptions in higher education in probably the last 10 or 15 years. That I'm really concerned it's not part of the discussion around the Accord in particular, and that's the social disruption. There has been a significant change in the way that people come to university and the role that university plays in people's lives. So when I first started working in the higher education sector 10 or 15 years ago, we were pretty much in the thick of responding to and delivering on. Does anybody remember the Bradley Review? That's probably come a little bit fuzzy. Into higher education in 2008. And when I became a learning designer, we were really looking at the various ways that we could ensure that students who come from disadvantaged backgrounds, first in family coming to university, would succeed in the higher education sector. And I have worked at universities since then where it seemed to be a shock to management, even 5 years ago, that most students work full-time while also studying full-time. And I was shocked that the institution I was working for, which is a GO8 at the time, was still a GO8, they don't change, was surprised at this. And I think there is a lot more to be said about the culture around that, and drawing things back and looking at the broader societal role of universities. When you look at the impact of that. So, and the reason I bring this up is because the Accord, the main findings of the Accord are that the government wants more students to come from a variety of backgrounds to get higher education qualifications. So we're talking students, people with disabilities, more Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, peoples from more disadvantaged backgrounds, and anybody who works in the higher education sector, particularly at regional universities or some of the outer metropolitan universities, will attest to the fact that those students actually require more support. And I'm not convinced as yet, but as a union official, it's kind of my job to remain skeptical about any government policy in terms of universities, that we're going to have the resources that we need to do that. So there are also threats from political influence and government influence. And I've got a lot of concerns, particularly around the way the government has changed tack quite dramatically from the conversations we're having at the very beginning of the Accord process about having, the Tertiary Education Commission set up as an independent body. But in the last couple of weeks, they have just announced that that's going to be sitting under the Department of Education and answerable to the Minister for Education. So there's still a threat there. In terms of what I think universities need to do, we're looking at currently, so I was working as a learning designer as recently as 2022, and we were still grappling with the implications, the impacts of pandemic era lockdowns, and what that meant for the students we were seeing. And with a lot of the academics that I was working with, I kept asking them, so how are the students going? And the overarching message that I got really was that students are quite traumatized still. So we're dealing with a current generation of young people. So these are students who are in higher education now, who will be coming into higher education in the next 5 years, and who have somehow just managed to complete their higher education, who have very different attributes, qualities, and support needs than we have actually seen probably in 100 years or more than, because 100 years ago, we didn't have a lot of students from equity backgrounds coming into higher education. And you certainly didn't have many women coming through. So we need to actually look at the university as a whole community. And in the future, I think that individual universities, the tertiary sector as a whole, really needs to do a much better job of consulting with its students and actually getting to know and understand the role that university has in students' lives. So that we need to find ways to support them better, even though I think there's a gap in understanding between some higher education workers, and it's really hard to get to know these people when they're coming through, particularly when you're a learning designer. You sit in a back office, you talk to the academics, you don't really get much of a chance to have face time with the students. And so that's a really critical part of the issue and the conversation. And I really echo the work that's in the Future Disruptions paper around the need for university to actually listen to its own experts on what we know about how adults learn, technology integrated learning, how that works, how it can work well, and to actually bring that to the forefront, because at the core of that, there's a real element of disrespect, not only of the research that really high quality researchers like Jason Lodge and others are doing, but also those of us who are like, oh, actually, no, I can see how that works, and we're trying to implement it in the way that they do their work, particularly as learning designers, and we're just being ignored and dismissed, and there's a general culture of disrespect that I think really needs to change.
Okay, thanks, Ruth. That's really interesting. I might just pass it to Jason to kind of respond to that. Why are universities not drawing on the expertise they have, or how might we change that?
That's a good question, Hank, and I think part of that is tradition. In order to progress up through the ranks, being a good researcher in any area was kind of and we've all lived, I think many of us have lived through those kinds of regimes where we've had, people who are in charge of large educational institutions who have no background whatsoever in education, and some of them have had clearly no interest. I think many of us have been in those kinds of situations before. I think all the points that have been raised so far are spot on. We're going to have an agree-a-thon this afternoon, I think. What I would say, though, is that I think that there are some parts of the system that I think are set up quite well for us to be having those conversations in a meaningful way. And what I mean by that is if some work that we were asked to do with my colleagues in the Institute for Social Science Research and the Institute for Teaching and Learning Innovation at UQ was to look at the higher education standards framework and really interrogate whether or not that was fit for purpose in the, supposed post-pandemic age. And we really forensically examined that framework, and it's really good. It's a solid place for us to start. And I think the kinds of conversations that we need to be having, it's embedded in the framework that we're all supposed to be complying with. Look after your students, make sure that you're transparent about the information that you give them, have good reasons why the curriculum is set up the way that it is, monitor and look at the risk that comes through various things around academic integrity. It really is a very, it's an outstanding piece of work. The people who put it together were really thought about that very carefully. Whether or not we're really complying with the spirit of that framework is probably another question. But I think that there is a really good foundation that we could potentially be working from there that's not just about risk. Risk is important, but is also about how do we support our students and what does good learning look like? So I think we do have a legislative and regulatory mechanism that we can point to and say, actually, this stuff's really important. This is what we're supposed to be doing. And although for most of us, if we're in universities, we're self-accrediting, those are the fundamentals of what we're supposed to be accrediting or accredited for. So I've found sometimes that that's one way to enter into the conversation, to say that, these are the foundational things that we say that we're doing as an institution. Are we really doing these things, and what kind of conversation do we need to have with the experts within the institution who know about those principles that are embedded in that framework? It's one way to at least start having that conversation, but given where we find ourselves at the moment, it's inevitable. We can't, it's been a mantra for the last 18 months for many of us. We can't just rely on outcomes anymore, although much of our system is driven by outcomes. We really have to take the process of learning seriously now.
Right, thanks, Jason. That's good. I'm going to just move to the next question, and focus this a little bit more on the implications for TELedvisors in particular. So we're talking about learning designers, educational technologists, academic developers, or third space workers in general. So for this group in particular, what are the implications of these disruptive forces, and what do you see as the opportunities and challenges for TELedvisors? I might start with Alex this time.
Thanks, Hank. So look, I think this is the age of the third space. I don't think an academic can now really say, I'm an expert in my knowledge area and I refuse to have any connection with technology. The idea of demanding that somebody be there in the room with them to push the buttons while they teach, I don't think we're going to win that argument. And administrators also increasingly, I think, can't just administrate without understanding what's actually happening in the classroom. And all the problems we end up with are because of that lack of knowledge. And so it's that interaction between the two that is so absolutely critical. It's so that the TELedvisor is the person who actually understands what good pedagogy is, and also understands the technology behind it, and also the administrative nightmare that sits behind the technology. So the TELedvisor is the person right in the centre of the fulcrum of this. And so it's probably the hardest job in the university, but it's also the most critical job in the university, because without it, everything falls apart. It becomes atomised. So I think the implications for TELedvisors, and that's why I was talking earlier about the sort of the rigid categories that we've got in universities, where we sort of tend to say, you're an academic, you're an administrator. I don't think that in the future that's a viable way of looking at things. I think we've got to be able to move from one role to the other. And you were all on a sort of a bit of a spectrum of expertise across these different matrices. Some of us are particularly good at technology, some of us are particularly good at teaching, some of us are great researchers, but we've all got to be able to do all of it. And the TELedvisor is the person in the middle who supports and coaches everybody else to be better at their job. So it's that the implication, I think, is that TELedvisors are going to be incredibly well sought after and incredibly overworked, because the future of universities sort of rides on their back in a sense.
Thanks, Alex. I'll pass it over to Ruth.
Yeah, thank you. There are some really interesting perspectives in there, Alex, and I think you're right, actually. The future is there for the TELedvisors to take, but there's a significant barrier to that, and that is the traditional university structures. And what we really need to see is our universities putting our TELedvisors to the forefront and respecting their work, which it also ties into respecting the work of our academics who are doing scholarship of learning and teaching work at our institutions, because that's what the TELedvisors are looking to. That they take the scholarship, and if they're fortunate enough to be able to participate in that scholarship, that's another but whether I'll park for now. The TELedvisors are the ones who are actually implementing that. And so we actually have this wealth of expertise within our institutions, but a culture that fundamentally disrespects their work, because they are classified as professional staff and traditionally seen as just administrators, whether that's just transformed now to, that's just the platform administrator. I have to say your platform administrator has quite a lot of power to make sure that you do or don't have egg on your face when you launch your unit at the beginning of each semester. So I think the future could actually be quite bright for workers in this space, but unfortunately we are still seeing, even in the era when the Accord has been released and there's great potential for an overhaul of funding for universities, and universities you might think they might be preparing for a change in the composition of their student body, but unfortunately we're seeing a number of universities rolling out redundancy and job cuts packages that are specifically targeting professional staff, as they often do. And even so we've got a regional university in Victoria that is currently going through some very severe job cuts, and almost their entire learning design team is being slashed out. So, I would like to think very much so that there is a bright future here. But the fact is, and I acknowledge Colin's comment in the chat, we need to get the KPMGs out of the conversation. We need to get these consulting agencies out of our higher education institutions, because they do not understand the work that we do. So our senior managements in universities, I would be shocked if there was a single vice chancellor who could actually define a learning designer, or even a learning and skills advisor job, or even a liaison librarian job accurately in terms of the actual work that we do day to day. And when it comes to, at the end of the day, we are the advocates for the students. And I'm not really convinced that these vice chancellors really understand the students and what the student experience is in the modern age.
Thanks, Ruth. I'll pass it over to Cherie with an additional question around. There was a comment earlier around, TELedvisors being often far removed from the students, or a number of layers back.
Yeah.
Do you see any opportunities in probably around technology to make students more accessible for TELedvisors so that they have a bit more of a sense of a changing student cohort?
Definitely. So I might, before I answer the question, I'll give a bit of background to some of the work I do at Western. So I head up our education innovation team, and part of that, and I know some of the teams on this call today, so they're welcome to jump into the chat and add their thoughts. But a key component is we work in micro-credential development across everything from just-in-time skilling, upskilling, professional development, CPD, etc., right through to stackable micro-credentials, including the higher ed funded micro-credential pilots, and more broadly in program development as well. And the pieces there, I think that there's a couple of layers to it. One, Western Sydney University has what we call our partnership pedagogy. And we do have students as partners as a way of working as well. The challenge, I think, for some of the ways, or some of the ways that universities or tertiary education providers have set up their collaborations with students, or that student voice cycle, is you tend to get a particular profile of students that are willing to commit their time or have the ability to provide that feedback, which may not be representative of your entire student body or your prospective student body. So I think there is an awareness piece, or a cycle of refreshing the voices that we're hearing in those particular rooms or feedback sessions that is important to consider. For the work that our team does, we have a slightly nuanced lens to that, because we talk about learners, not students. Because again, when we're looking at lifelong learning, they're rarely enrolled students, or they might be enrolled students and this is a value add to their program, or it's embedded in different ways. But part of the reason we talk about learners is often with a university mindset or a traditional mindset, there is a different power dynamic in how we treat students or consider students in that cycle versus learners and consumer choice that comes into it. And I'm that person that often in conversations uses words like product and customer experience and that sort of stuff, which doesn't always sit well in some elements of conversations. But it's important for a couple of reasons. One is we talk about target audience, learner personas, what does that look like? And we don't stop there. We actually go out and interview those target learners to get their insights. Where possible, we talk to the employers and industry representatives of who are hiring or have staff members that may do our micro-credentials and programs. And importantly in that cycle is that collaboration. So the way we position it in the conversations we have and the co-design process is that if we think about the learner or the student at the center, the actual stakeholders that I position as having equal say in that design process is, yes, the academic and the SME is vital, but they are just as vital as the learning designer, UX, LX, media, etc., as well as the industry representative, because that's the other consideration we have in how we scope and design our process. That being said, I'm really conscious of the uplifting and the education piece that the team does in actually taking academics on that journey, because it is a different way of working for many of them. And we also can't assume that they've had the education training that a number of our staff have had, or understand that pedagogical knowledge and research, or even access or time to have access and reflect on what are the learning analytics telling us in that process and cycle as well. So I saw a comment pop up that it takes a village. It definitely does take a village. And that is part of the change process that takes time to embed that. You need the success stories and the wins to be able to have advocates talking on our behalf. And I'm conscious I've said a lot, so I'm going to pause and let someone else talk. Thank you.
Thanks, Cherie. I'm conscious of time as well, so I might just move to Jason, but also to the next question, which is about generative AI. So, and the role of TELedvisors in response to the opportunities and challenges that generative AI presents. So how do you think they should position themselves?
Well, I mean, there've been so many great comments made. It strikes me that part of the reason we find ourselves in trouble now and having to respond to an RFI from Texa in 6 days' time is that perhaps the expertise we have, and I'm looking at the names in this meeting right now, hasn't been deployed effectively enough. And that's why we haven't made the changes that, let's face it, a lot of the things about the ways that we assess are things that many people here know we've needed for a long time. You know, it's not just the last 18 months that this has been a problem. Dave Bowd was talking about this, you know, the problems with assessment 15 years ago. And again, many on this call know that. Do our senior colleagues have that same awareness of what's going on? Maybe they do now, but it's kind of interesting that we find ourselves in this situation when we probably should have been making these changes a decade ago. So that's the first thing I would say. And I think many of the comments, both in the chat and that the panel have made, allude to the change that is required. And I'm hopeful that despite the fact that many people have said that this is a very slow process, and it is, that I think hopefully the tide is turning. As far as AI goes, perhaps that is the catalyst to get us to move a little quicker. Maybe it won't be in the long run. I guess time will tell on that, but we need to do something. And I think, as I alluded to before, who our competitors are, I think is changing and going to continue to rapidly change. So if we don't get our act together and start doing what we know is good practice, and in many cases have known for a long time is good practice, then we're going to get tailed up. Somebody else is going to come and eat our lunch. So I see TELedvisors as being absolutely critical in that discussion for all the reasons that we've already heard. You know, and my hope is that we will have a much better way of interacting within institutions. I think at UQ we're some way towards that. We have fantastic TELedvisors, broadly defined, and I think we are working towards giving those people the platform and the role within the institution that they deserve, given their expertise and knowledge. But it does take time to change these systems, particularly an institution like ours, which is a long-standing traditional institution. We have policies on top of policies on top of policies. Many of those are there for a good reason, but it does take a long time and effort to change those. But my hope is we're headed in the right direction, and AI might be a catalyst to get us to move a little bit quicker in that right direction. Here's hoping.
Thanks, Jason. Alex.
Look, I'll be slightly more positive than Jason, I think, and because I think the thing that I seem to notice all the time is that everybody is scared of what they don't know. So everybody's freaked out about AI because they haven't played with enough. They don't understand what its limitations are. They haven't really thought about new ways of assessing. It's the if you don't know, say no sort of attitude, which everybody goes to when they're fearful. And what I see across the university is those pockets where everything is less scary and there's a lot more experimentation are where there's a TELedvisor in there with lots of advice and lots of show and tells. Like, you can do this. This is a way to do it. That sort of practical on the ground advice that gives people something rather than here are the rules that you can and you can't do. Here's an example of how it actually worked, and it worked for this person down the corridor. So why don't you have a go? And it's that socialization through communities of practice. So we just started up a community of practice for AI and had 200 academics and professional staff join in a week. And it's just going, it's going gangbusters because everybody just wants to talk to somebody about what's happening in AI. And I think that's where the TELedvisors are the glue for this. And if you've got a university with a strong group of TELedvisors who are connected and who are recognised and whose opinions get amplified. So the really important thing, I think, is to find ways to make sure that the insights that the TELedvisors have can be amplified up through Teams channels or up through blog posts or things like that. And you can just see, I mean, look at what Danny Liu's done at Sydney Uni. I mean, it's a small group of people, but just by doing a lot of publicity around it, it's had a massive impact. And I think every university's got TELedvisors who can do that. And so it's finding ways to amplify those voices. And I think that's the huge advantage that we've got, because we've got a fundamental change in the way in which we think about learning and the way in which we think about assessing. And it's all change is good and bad, but it's about how do you find someone to help you through the change. And that's overwhelmingly going to be the TELedvisors.
Thanks, Alex. Lots of work ahead then, Ruth.
Yes, absolutely. And I'm probably the least qualified person on this panel to really talk about the enduring impact of AI in terms of the way we work in universities and how that can contribute to curriculum design opportunities and assessment. It's just been one of those pieces that I'm a bit fearful of, because I have not had the time since shifting into the NTEU role to really delve really deeply into. But where I would urge caution, and so the worst part of my job actually is hearing the worst stories from workers in the sector. And one of the worst stories at the moment is a university in Victoria proposing to replace professional staff with chatbots. And we're talking about staff in libraries and student support services. And this brings back my fundamental view that I held, very much for a long time as a learning designer, is there is a reason why we can't just all go and grab a textbook and become an expert in economics or maths or any other topic that the textbook might be written on. Education is fundamentally a human process, and it is a process, and we all know that. And it's a very unique scenario where, in my view, students are not customers, because you're actually asking something more of students than you would ever ask of a customer in a business relationship. And there is something very fundamentally human about that relationship that actually can't be replaced by a machine. But maybe it will be in the future. I don't know. There's probably a lot of science fiction out there that would suggest that we could replace some people in some roles, even in healthcare, with artificial intelligence. But in terms of the here and now, I am very concerned about the job threat opportunity, the job threats from the rollout of this technology, mostly because I think our senior managers in our institutions don't really understand fully the work that is done, and the nuanced relationships that all manner of staff have with the student body.
Thanks, Ruth. Final word on this from Cherie.
Thanks. I guess for me, when I look at the opportunities of AI, the way we've been approaching it is through proof of concepts and testing and MVPs, with a focus on a couple of things. One is, how do we build curiosity and understanding of the potential? How does that then inform or change our current way of working? So if I talk about a couple of specific examples. So first of all, we did a pilot of the Gen AI tools that Open Learning has developed for educators. Open Learning is the platform. Obviously, I know it well. I used to work there, but we use it for our micro-credentials at the university. And the piece for consideration for us was, what is the output and how does it help to inform our design process and development process from a learning experience? And it's not about how do we do things with less. It's actually more about how do we take out some of the manual processes to then allow more time for things like the ideation, the scoping, and the testing or feedback loop that goes into it. And I think that's a key consideration, is how do we use Gen AI to help enable, rather than looking at it purely from what does it mean we can cut or remove. If I look at a different lens to it, is we've also done things like developed our MetaHuman, and we'll share a link in a second, that looks at how do we do things such as develop those soft skills, which I don't actually think are soft, but the transferable skills, durable skills that also provide access and equity or different experiences that would be difficult to do without expecting everyone to be on campus and face-to-face. And the elements that go within that is, what does that also mean from our ability to measure? So Western last year became principal partners with EdgeGrowth in developing an EdTech innovation network. And some of the conversations that we've had today in terms of collaboration and conversations, as well as measuring impact, is what's key behind that, because what we're looking to do is actually develop a more scalable and robust model where we have the dialogue and the collaboration between education providers, EdTech, and research, that we're able to demonstrate the efficacy of what we're doing from a TEL perspective as well. A challenge being is that we often have so many choices from what AI we could be testing and playing with, that it'd be very easy to spend all of our time just talking to different vendors and providers versus what are those use cases, and starting with what problem are we trying to solve, or what would enhance our ability to support educators, professional staff, and students or learners, depending on which the target audience is in that experience itself. And I think we need to keep that at the center of why we're doing this. Thank you.
Thanks, Cherie. The final question for today relates to demographics and equity, which is a significant part of this report. And so I'm wondering what role TELedvisors can play in response to the opportunities and challenges related to that. I'll start with Jason.
Thanks, Hank. I think we're still trying to figure that out. I think AI, there are some very specific things happening around AI that I think are exacerbating digital divides that we've known have been there for a long time. And I know that digital divides can be a controversial term, but you know, if you're a kid who went to high school in Mount Isa or somewhere and there's not enough internet access and you just can't send through enough tokens to an AI and get that kind of experience, then it's not really fair to be expecting students to come in with some sort of exposure to these tools at the first place. So there are some of those issues that I think are really important. Notwithstanding Danny's point, I see Danny's name on the list here about humans and machines working together. I think that there is something kind of fundamentally human that is absolutely critical in the discussions that we need to have now and into the future. I don't necessarily see it as being an issue of what's left for humans, but more what makes us human. So those things I think can cut across different equity groups in very different ways that I think we still need to do quite a lot of work to figure out. Part of the reason I say that is that there are some of the fundamentals about equity issues, fairness, transparency, privacy, bias, that are really big ticket items that we need to be careful of about the AI tools that are out there. I think the schools framework does a reasonable job in setting a foundation for that. We're working on a translation of that framework for higher education. My hope is, and that work is in collaboration with Access, NESHI, as we, we're fond of calling it before. And I think that that will give us a foundation, hopefully, to be able to have more nuanced conversations about what this technology means across equity groups. My sense is that it's complicated, and there's quite a bit of work to do to figure out, where the human is in this, what digital divides are being exacerbated, but also what kinds of opportunities are there for helping across the full spectrum of students, to use this technology in a smart way, I think, as Cherie is alluding to help facilitate relationships. Because ultimately, for me, that's what education is about. It's about relationships. It's not a transaction. And how can we deploy this technology in a way to help facilitate those relationships and get the best possible learning for all of our students? And I think that's an open question, but hopefully it's something that we can work on together.
Well, thanks, Jason. Cherie.
Demographic and equity. So I have put in there about our Adobe Creative Campus partnership. I think there's a couple of lenses, I think. One is Western Sydney. We are very fortunate to have a very diverse demographic of students that we support. Not just the multiculturalism, but also the proportion of our First Nations students and staff as part of that broader group as well. For us, demographics is and equity is really at the key of the decisions that we make. The other lens that we haven't spoken to so far in this conversation, but it's in the disruption report that we're talking about, is about sustainability. And I think that's another part of the conversation, particularly about AI, about what is the sustainability and the environmental impact, because it does have one as well. When I think about this from a not just access and how do we do that in a scalable and accessible way, I think a consideration from a TEL perspective that isn't always quite there, or we don't necessarily have the flexibility sometimes to consider, is often when we talk about accessibility and that equity piece, it sometimes is too easy to fall into the trap of, in order to make it equitable and accessible to everyone, that we then end up with a cookie cutter approach, or that it has to have met every particular need in that cycle, versus what is enabled or what's the best experience in that particular circumstance, and being comfortable that we may have different opportunities or different delivery models depending on the particular needs of that cohort. And that is something that I think we can draw upon if we look at it from a tertiary education perspective. In vocational, they have what's called TASs, so training and assessment strategies, where if you have a specific cohort need, you have a tailored TAS that supports that, then explains how you've tailored it to that particular cohort. Often we don't necessarily have that in higher education, or that we feel that we have to, be able to cater to everyone in the same experience. That doesn't necessarily result in the best experience, is my observation as a whole. And that not only goes to when I talk about accessibility from a learning design and experience perspective, but also the delivery models, how we do things like timetabling, study loads, everything that flows into it. Thank you.
Thanks, Cherie. Ruth.
Yeah, thanks. I think there's there is a really big piece around equity and demographics when we reference what's currently going on with the Accord. As I mentioned earlier, there's a very big, I think the big underpinning of the Accord is around getting more students with disabilities into higher education in general, more Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students into the system, but frankly, we also need more Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander workers working as educators in the sector. We need to ensure that we have appropriate community and linkages and support for all these groups. And I mean, what we really learned out of the Bradley review in 2008, there was a whole heap of research that was done after that period of time around what are the student success factors that will actually encourage people to actually design the university courses and the university experiences, you know, from enrollment through to graduation and everything in between, to enable those what was labelled then non-traditional students to succeed. And we really need to be looking at all of the, as you mentioned, context is everything. You know, the variety of context across all of our universities. So I'll tell a story. When I was working at La Trobe University, which has a couple of regional and rural campuses. You know, some of the research that we were doing in my team was actually exploring the students' use of technology with their learning materials and tools. And we actually found that a whole bunch of students, you didn't have to live that far out of, you know, a central regional town in Victoria to have no internet access at home. So no mobile internet access. That was only 10 years ago. I don't know how much has changed in terms of the improved rollout of the NBN, but there will still be cohorts around Australia who have to go all the way into campus to access their educational, just the basic things. So when we're talking about blended learning models, for example, where you're requiring students to do quite a fair slab of their learning as self-directed learning using online materials, you've got to have a certain percentage that have to travel a distance to use some sort of public internet access. And that isn't always factored in because a lot of us, you know, working in cities, we see smartphones everywhere, you know, and still 10 years ago, we still needed to think about those people who were using so-called dumb phones. You didn't see them using them because, you know, it's not something you have on your desk. It doesn't do anything other than send and receive text messages and phone calls. So you don't have it on the desk next to you all the time. So you don't see people really using them. And that's where the TELedvisors play a really crucial role in reminding people about the difference and divergence among people, and particularly among the learners in the community. And I think where we need to go for the future is, like I said before, we need to do a ton of sociological research around the characteristics of our future learners.
Thanks, Ruth. I'm just gonna. I'm just a bit wary of time. We've actually out of time. I'm sure there's loads of questions, but we've got a TELedvisor space where we can have discussions, where we can keep these discussions going. I just wanted to. I want everyone to thank our panel for today: Cherie Diaz, Alex Steele, Ruth Jelley, and Jason Lodge. I think it was an excellent discussion. Thank you very much. And I'll just, before we go, I just want to hand it over to Colin Simpson, who wants to talk a little bit about the Third Space Symposium that's coming up towards the end of the year. Colin.
Sorry, thank you, Hank. Yeah, I'll just echo Hank's remarks. That really was a wonderful discussion. I think we did cover a lot of ground there, and I think it might have been Jason mentioned we're all in furious agreement. So yeah, I really got a lot out of this. And I actually think that is the kind of stuff that is really valuable to talk about in events like the Third Space Symposium, which we have coming up. So if people aren't aware, Third Space is basically people working across and between the academic and professional domain. So the TELedvisors we've been talking about, but also, you know, your liaison librarians and study skills people, and a very wide range of people in tertiary education. So what we're aiming to do is try and drill into some of these issues in two ways. So the Third Space Symposium is going to be made up of two events. We're going to have an online asynchronous slowposium. So it'll largely be people sharing resources, uploading recordings of presentations, discussions. I am quite inclined to add the discussion that we've just had here. And then people will be able to go in and have, add comments and, annotate documents and do all of those kinds of things. So that'll run from Friday, the 15th of November through to Saturday, the 30th of November. And then the day before the Ascolite conference kicks off on Sunday, the 1st of December, we'll go and have a little bit of a gathering. So the Slowposium is intended for all aspects of the third space. Then the symposium in person at Arts West, Melbourne University. Some people call it Mahmood Hall, I believe. And that'll just be a day where we sort of spend a little bit of time together, again, talking through these things and trying to workshop some solutions. If you're interested in finding out more, we've got a website up, we've got a call for presentations up. I'll just pop the link in the chat. And we'd love to have you involved in any way you can. Thanks.
Thanks, Colin. And thanks again, everyone. Have a good rest of your day.